Hey guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and I'm here to talk about kind of the more social aspects of the 1920s in chapter 23. So, when I look at kind of social issues of this time period, I often think of three themes. Number one, shared cultural experiences. So, Americans experiencing music and movies together, a rebellious nature that is brewing, especially among not only America's teenagers, but among women as well. And then social tensions, people who want life to return to the way it was prior to World War I, and people who are seeking change afterwards. So I'm going to touch on each of these three themes over the next few minutes. When it comes to shared cultural experiences, one of those experiences comes through the written word. And we see a group of writers that become known as the Lost Generation write really prominent works, such as Ernest Hemingway and The Sun Also Rises, F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby. But what's important to note is kind of where their inspiration came from. This is Gertrude Stein, who coined the phrase the lost generation. And many of these writers felt pretty disillusioned with the way America kind of responded to World War I. Some of these writers served during World War I. They saw other Americans sacrificing their lives. And so they really felt disillusioned with not only that sacrifice, but they also saw the rise of a very materialistic society. And so many of these writers actually spent some time in Europe during the 1920s in places that they believed had kind of a stronger culture. And they were able to write kind of these great works from Europe. Again, much of the works centering around this theme of the materialism of the 1920s and disillusionment after World War I. On a little bit of a happier note, the radio becomes one of the most prolific inventions of the 1920s. And by 1930, there are over 800 radio stations and over 10 million radios, which meant that approximately 1/3 of all American families had a radio. You'll notice from this photo that this family's, ever so sweetly gathered around the radio. That's what they did. In the evenings, Americans would gather and they would listen to news programs, they would listen to sporting events, soap operas, comedy shows, dramas, you name it. The National Broadcasting Company, or NBC, was created in 1924, and the Amos and Andy Show is one of the most popular comedies of the time. And you'll notice these men are dressed up. They are broadcasting from a studio, and it's as if they're acting, right? And instead of maybe watching it on TV, you're listening to it on the radio. This is also where many Americans are exposed to jazz music. Now, I know you've heard about jazz music already, which came north through the Black Great Migration, but radios made jazz music accessible, and it very much appealed to the youth of America. Another shared cultural experience is the movies. So during this time period, we really see the rise of Hollywood. Although most movies are silent, meaning there are words on the screen and there are actors, but we don't hear their dialogue. We do see the first talking picture in 1927, which is called The Jazz Singer. But we also, as a society, become very mesmerized by Hollywood, the lives of actors and actresses. We see kind of celebrity magazines take shape. And again, Americans are able to kind of escape to the theater during this time. And that is The Jazz Singer. All right. Moving on to the second theme, we see kind of a rebellious streak taking shape among America's women. So I think a lot of this stems from the fact that A, many women worked during World War I and kept those jobs even after the war was over. And B, women were given the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And so women were kind of breaking down other barriers, and that includes some social barriers and social expectations. We do see during this time the rise of the flapper. And I know sometimes when we think of the 1920s, we often conjure up images of flappers, women with, shorter dresses above the knee, which was very scandalous, kind of shorter bobbed hair. Many of these women smoked, they drank, they drove cars, and they danced to jazz music. And so they were really kind of rebelling against societal expectations of what a woman should look like and should act like. Margaret Sanger here also contributed to that with her improvements to modern day birth control. So Margaret Sanger is a name that is synonymous with the progressive era. She is synonymous with labor strikes and working conditions. And she also believed that if women had access to birth control, that would be helpful in eradicating poverty in the United States. She also worked to repeal something called the Comstock Law, which essentially prohibited the distribution of obscene material through the mail. And at the time, birth control was considered an obscene topic. She did continue to send pamphlets and information, and actually did spend some time in jail. She opened one of her first clinics in 1923, which goes on to become known as Planned Parenthood in much later days. And by 1936, it did become legal for doctors to prescribe birth control to women. So this does give women a little bit more of a choice when it comes to how they live and they work, when they get married, when they have children, etc. Okay. Now, the third theme here is social tensions. People arguing essentially over different issues. And the first is the eradication of alcohol. So we know that there have been various groups throughout history that have been trying to get rid of alcohol, believing that it would cure a variety of issues, solve issues of poverty, it would improve the health of Americans, and it would return America to kind of these good Christian morals and values. The anti-German sentiment from World War I and the fact that many German brewers and companies existed in the United States helped push for the 18th Amendment to be passed. So the 18th Amendment was passed in 1917, and it made the sale, manufacture, and transport of alcohol illegal. It did not make alcohol illegal to drink, but you could not make it, you could not sell it, and you could not transport it. And the government agencies used the Volstead Act to enforce the 18th Amendment. Now, as we know, there are many people who are against prohibition, and they kind of rebel by opening speakeasies, kind of these underground bars that serve bootlegged liquor and play jazz music. In many American cities, there are organized crime rings that are created that work and make a lot of money bootlegging alcohol throughout the United States. You're probably familiar with Al Capone, who did this in Chicago. Eventually, the 18th Amendment will be repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment. But for over a decade, America was technically dry. And then, of course, we have religious fundamentalists versus modernists. So what does that mean? Well, if you take a look at the Bible, right, many religious fundamentalists at this time believed that the Bible should be interpreted literally and that every word was true. There are modernists who begin to arise, who begin to kind of apply science and history and take a more critical approach to looking at the Bible. They also believed in the theory of evolution as proposed by Darwin, in that we are all, descendants of species, that evolve over time. And so in many states, teaching about the theory of evolution was considered illegal. And one state in particular where it was illegal was Tennessee. John Scopes was a teacher who didn't directly teach the theory of evolution, but he basically incriminated himself so that he would get arrested and charged with violating the Butler Act, which made it illegal to teach the theory of evolution. So he specifically did this in order to test the validity of this law. A huge trial takes place in 1925, known as the Scopes trial, in which John Scopes is put on the stand and charged with violating the Butler Act. So again, he's agreeing to do this. His defense attorney is Clarence Darrow, who makes very passionate pleas in favor of evolution and really takes his enemy, if you will, William Jennings Bryan, to task. So William Jennings Bryan serves as the attorney for the prosecution. And over a series of days, both men, just give these long, impassioned kind of speeches and really rouse the emotion of the courtroom. Outside of the courtroom, it was a complete circus. People were barbecuing, there were circus games, and this trial just got a ton of publicity and fanfare. It really comes to a head when Clarence Darrow decides to put William Jennings Bryan on the stand, and basically puts him on the stand as an expert on the Bible. And he's able to kind of back William Jennings Bryan into a corner. And he realizes that maybe he isn't quite the expert he thought he was, and maybe there are some things that cannot be explained or proven. Despite that, John Scopes is found guilty, and he is fined $100. This is all eventually overturned. And sadly, William Jennings Bryan passes away days later. But it just kind of shows you, I think, in all of this, how life is changing in the 1920s, and it's changing at a very rapid pace. And some people are ready for change and others are not. So I hope that helps you guys understand kind of, again, the social issues that were taking place. Again, we've got shared cultural experiences, rebellious streaks, and social tensions. Hope you guys have a great